I said, if God is real, let him prove it. The miracle that changed my life forever. Ex-Atheist testimony. Before sharing my testimony, comment below where you are listening from to know how far my story has reached. I grew up in a house where God was never mentioned, not even once at the dinner table. My parents weren't religious, and faith was treated like something outdated, almost laughable. The Bible was there on a shelf, but it was just another book collecting dust, like an old dictionary nobody opened. When I asked about it once, my mum shrugged and said it was a storybook for people who can't handle reality. That answer was enough for me at the time. I never pressed further. My home was filled with talk about work, money, vacations, and responsibilities, but never about prayer or God. For us, life was about surviving, earning, and enjoying. That was all. I still remember being a kid and visiting a friend's house for dinner. Before we ate, his family bowed their heads and prayed. I didn't know what to do, so I just stared at the food and waited for them to finish. I remember feeling out of place, almost embarrassed for them. Later, when I told my parents, they laughed and called it a silly little ritual people do to feel better. That laughter planted a seed in me. From that day forward, whenever I saw people praying, I thought of them as weak. It wasn't admiration or curiosity, it was pity. I saw faith as nothing more than make-believe for people too afraid to face the truth. Church was never something we even considered. Sunday mornings in my family meant sleeping in, watching TV, or going out for breakfast. Sometimes we'd drive by a church and see families walking in, dressed nicely, and I'd ask why we didn't go. My dad would chuckle and say, "Those poor people, wasting their day on a fairy tale." It seemed normal to me. I didn't know any different. To me, religion wasn't just unnecessary, it was foolish. I grew up with the belief that God was for people who didn't have enough strength to handle life on their own, and I was determined never to be like them. As a kid, though, there were nights when I'd lie awake and wonder. I'd look out my bedroom window at the stars, endless and bright, and something inside me whispered, there has to be more. I didn't tell anyone those thoughts. I buried them deep, because in my house, questions like that weren't welcome. If I had asked my parents, they would have brushed it off with a joke. So I kept it to myself, pretending not to care. But the truth is, part of me did wonder if maybe there was something or someone out there watching. When I was in school, I remember being asked once if I believed in God. I laughed out loud, not because I thought it was funny, but because I wanted everyone to know the answer was obvious. Of course not. Believing in God was for kids who believed in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. That's how I saw it. And the more I laughed, the more confident I became in rejecting anything to do with faith. Teachers, classmates, even strangers. If someone brought up religion, I had a quick remark ready to shut it down. It became part of my identity. I was the one who wasn't fooled by fairy tales. My parents reinforced that attitude without even trying. They never sat me down to talk about faith, but their silence was just as powerful. Birthdays, holidays, even Christmas. It was all about gifts, food, and family gatherings, never about Jesus or church. Easter was about candy. Christmas was about Santa. We celebrated traditions, but we stripped them of anything spiritual. By the time I was a teenager, I didn't just think faith was unimportant. I thought it was a complete waste of time. I also started noticing that the kids who went to church seemed different. They had this calm about them, a kind of peace I couldn't explain. Instead of respecting it, I mocked it. I called them names, teased them for believing in something I thought was fake. I remember once telling a girl in my class that her prayers were nothing but talking to the ceiling. She looked at me with such sadness in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt something, guilt maybe, but I quickly pushed it away. Mocking faith gave me a strange sense of control, like I was above them. At home, the subject of God never came up, except when my parents made jokes. If a tragedy happened in the news, my dad would sarcastically say, "Where's God now?" If someone mentioned miracles, my mom would roll her eyes. Their attitude rubbed off on me, shaping me into someone who didn't just doubt but despised the very idea of faith. I grew up believing that people used God as a crutch, and I was proud of the fact that I didn't need one. To me, strength meant standing on your own, with no higher power to lean on. But deep down, I carried questions I never admitted. Why did I sometimes feel empty even when everything was fine? Why did moments of silence make me restless, like something was missing? I didn't want to admit it, but those questions haunted me at night. I tried to drown them out with distractions, video games, movies, hanging out with friends, but in the quiet, they always returned. Even though I claimed not to believe in God, I couldn't fully escape the thought of Him. It was easier to laugh than to face the possibility that I was wrong. So my childhood passed in a world without prayer, without church, and without faith. God was a stranger to me, a name people used but never meant anything real. I carried that into my teenage years, convinced I was smarter than those who believed. I thought I had life figured out. I thought I was in control. But looking back now, I can see the truth clearly. Even when I didn't believe in Him, God was watching. He was patient, waiting for the day when my walls would finally start to crumble. When I stepped into my teenage years, everything inside me hardened. I wasn't just indifferent to God anymore, I was openly against Him, or at least the idea of Him. In school, whenever the topic of faith came up, I made sure everyone knew where I stood. I would roll my eyes, laugh, or throw out some sarcastic comment that made others chuckle. To me, it wasn't just about disbelief, it was about proving a point. I wanted everyone to see that I was smarter than those who prayed or went to church. It felt like my mission to show people that faith was foolishness. Science became my shield. I started reading articles, watching documentaries, and memorizing little facts I could use against believers. If someone mentioned miracles, I'd talk about coincidences. If they brought up creation, I'd bring up evolution. I thought I was winning arguments, scoring points in a game nobody else was playing. The truth is, I didn't understand most of what I was quoting, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I sounded confident, and in my teenage mind, that was enough to make me right. Logic was another weapon I loved to use. I'd ask questions like, if God is real, why is there suffering? Or, if He made the world, who made Him? I didn't actually care about the answers. I just wanted to corner people and watch them squirm. Seeing someone stumble over their words gave me a rush. It made me feel powerful, like I was the one in control of the conversation. My heart wasn't searching for truth, it was searching for pride. And every time I mocked someone's belief, I felt like I had built my walls even higher. I remember one time a classmate invited me to a youth group at his church. I laughed in his face. I told him I'd rather watch paint dry than sit in a room full of people singing to the ceiling. He looked embarrassed, and people around us laughed, which only fed my ego more. Later that night, I thought about how cruel I had been, but instead of feeling guilty, I convinced myself I had done him a favor. Better he learn now that God isn't real, I told myself. That's how twisted my thinking had become. It got to the point where mocking Christians became part of my identity. People expected me to say something sarcastic whenever the subject came up. I became the guy who always had a clever comeback, the one who made others laugh at believers. And the more I played that role, the more I believed it myself. I thought I was too smart, too logical, too grounded in reality to fall for what I saw as a man-made invention. Religion was just a crutch for the weak, and I told myself I was strong enough to walk without it. Deep down, though, I wasn't as confident as I pretended. There were moments when life felt heavy, when pain or loneliness would hit, and I'd catch myself wondering if maybe faith really did give people something real. But instead of exploring that thought, I buried it under more sarcasm. Mockery became my way of running from the truth. If I could laugh at God, I wouldn't have to face the possibility that He might be there, watching me, waiting for me. It was easier to laugh than to face the silence of my own doubts. I loved telling people that science had all the answers. But when I was alone, I knew science didn't tell me why I felt empty at times, or why nothing ever seemed enough. It could explain the stars in the sky, but it couldn't explain the ache in my heart. Still, I refused to admit it. Instead, I put on a mask of arrogance. I mocked faith, mocked prayer, mocked anything that had the slightest trace of God in it. My pride wouldn't let me even consider the possibility that I was missing something. As I grew older, my challenges got bolder. I would say things like, "If God is real, let him strike me down right now." My friends laughed, and I laughed too, pretending it was all a joke. But deep inside, part of me waited for something to happen, some kind of lightning bolt from heaven. Nothing ever did, so I convinced myself that it proved I was right. Each unanswered challenge became another brick in the wall I was building between me and God. I remember reading articles online where people described encounters with God, miracles, or answered prayers. Instead of being curious, I tore their stories apart. I called them liars, dreamers, or just desperate people trying to make sense of coincidence. It was easier to dismiss their testimonies than to admit I had no explanation for the peace they claimed to have. I told myself I didn't need peace. I had pride, logic, and control. That was enough, or at least I wanted it to be. Looking back, I see how blind I was. My arrogance wasn't strength. It was insecurity disguised as confidence. I mocked God because I didn't want to face the emptiness inside me. I hid behind sarcasm because I was afraid of silence, afraid of the questions I didn't want to answer. But at the time, I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was untouchable. What I didn't know was that life was about to test me in ways I never imagined, and the walls I built so proudly would soon start to crumble. By the time I became an adult, my disbelief wasn't just part of me, it was who I was. I carried it like a badge of honor, proud of how rational and logical I had become. While some people wore crosses around their necks, I wore my atheism in my words, in my attitude, in the way I carried myself. I thought it set me apart from the crowd, like I was above all the so-called believers. In every conversation, I made sure people knew I didn't need faith to stand strong. To me, it wasn't a weakness. It was proof of intelligence. I started surrounding myself with people who thought the same way. We would sit for hours, talking about science, philosophy, or politics, and always the subject of religion would come up. That was when I shined. I'd lean back, smirk, and throw out clever lines that I'd memorized from books and debates. My favorite one, the one I repeated like a mantra, was, "If God is real, let him prove it." Every time I said it, I felt untouchable. No one could give me an answer that satisfied me, and that made me feel superior. The pride inside me grew like a fire. If someone said they prayed for healing, I laughed and said medicine did the work. If they said God gave them peace, I said it was just psychology. If they claimed God spoke to them, I mocked them for hearing voices. My words weren't just arguments, they were daggers, meant to cut deep. I wanted people to feel small, to realize how foolish I thought they were. And when they looked hurt, I told myself I was doing them a favor. In my mind, I was waking them up from their fantasy. It reached the point where challenging people became almost a sport. I'd go online, find religious forums or videos, and leave sarcastic comments. In real life, I'd interrupt conversations with mocking questions. I wasn't just questioning faith anymore, I was ridiculing it. And every time someone failed to respond, I felt like I had won. Pride filled me up, convincing me I was smarter than anyone who still believed in a higher power. I told myself I didn't need God. I was my own God, my own source of strength and direction. But even as I laughed at others, I knew there was an emptiness inside me that I couldn't explain. When I laid my head down at night, the silence was deafening. I would scroll through my phone, watch videos, or drown myself in distractions just to avoid thinking too deeply. Yet the questions always lingered. What if I was wrong? What if there was something beyond what I could see? Instead of wrestling with those questions, I drowned them in pride. I told myself doubt was weakness, and weakness was for believers, not for me. Still, the more I mocked God, the more obsessed I became with him. It was strange. I claimed he didn't exist, yet I talked about him more than anything else. I debated, I argued, I mocked. It was like I couldn't get him out of my system, even if all I wanted was to deny him. Deep inside, maybe I was hoping for a response, for some undeniable proof that he was real. But since nothing happened, I grew bolder, louder, more aggressive. My disbelief became my identity, and I wasn't about to let it go. I remember vividly one night with friends when I stood up, raised my glass and declared, "If God is real, let him prove it right now." Everyone laughed and I laughed too, but in that moment, I held my breath. I half expected something to happen, something dramatic, but nothing did. The silence seemed to confirm everything I believed. I used it as fuel, as proof that I had the final word. I lifted my chin higher, convinced that I had defeated an invisible opponent. That moment became my favorite story to tell at parties. The more I repeated my challenges, the more reckless they became. I wasn't just mocking faith anymore. I was daring God, as if I wanted to provoke him. I'd say things like, "If he's real, let him stop me," or "If he exists, he should show up." These words came out with a smile, but deep down, they were cries for proof, desperate attempts to be noticed. I wanted to be right, but I also wanted to be answered. And when no answer came, I hardened my heart even more. I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was standing on unshakable ground, stronger than the fragile faith of those around me. Pride blinded me, convincing me that I had built my life on solid reason. But what I didn't realize was that pride is a weak foundation, one that cracks under pressure. Life has a way of shaking everything you think you know, and I was about to find that out in ways I could never have imagined. My mocking words would come back to haunt me. At that time, though, I didn't see it coming. I lived my life in arrogance, walking around as if I had all the answers. I was proud to be an atheist, proud to stand against what I saw as foolish superstition. Every time I said, "If God is real, let him prove it," I thought I had closed the case. But in truth, those words weren't closing anything. They were opening a door I didn't know I had stepped through, a door that would soon lead me face to face with the very God I denied. On the outside, I looked like I had it all together. I had a good job, I worked hard, and people around me thought I was confident, strong, and even a little intimidating. I had money to spend, friends to laugh with, and achievements that looked good on paper. But when the noise of the day faded and I was left alone in my apartment, a heavy silence surrounded me. That was when the cracks started to show, though I tried to hide them. No one knew how empty I felt inside. I remember sitting in my living room late at night, scrolling endlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself. I'd watch videos, read articles, even argue with strangers online, anything to keep my mind busy. But eventually, the distractions ended, and I was left staring at the ceiling, wondering why I felt so restless. It didn't matter how much I achieved during the day. At night, there was always this whisper inside me that said, "Is this all there is?" I hated that question, but it wouldn't go away. The strange part was that I still kept mocking religion, even as I started to feel that emptiness. Whenever someone talked about faith, I doubled down on my sarcasm. It was like I was covering up a wound, making jokes so no one could see how much I was hurting. Deep down, though, I started to wonder if maybe those people who prayed and talked about God had something I didn't. But my pride wouldn't let me admit that. I'd rather die than admit I might be missing something. Work became my obsession. I poured myself into it, thinking success would quiet the doubts. And for a while, it seemed to work, until the silence returned each night. No matter how many hours I worked, how much I earned, or how many people congratulated me, the peace never came. Instead, I felt like I was chasing something that was always just out of reach. The more I chased, the more tired I became. And the more tired I was, the louder the emptiness inside me grew. Sometimes, when I was alone, the thought would hit me like a cold wave. What if I'm wrong? It was a thought I couldn't laugh off. I tried to bury it under more distractions, more work, more drinks with friends, more late nights out. But it always came back. It followed me like a shadow, waiting in the quiet moments to confront me. I hated that question, but I couldn't kill it. The doubt was small, but it was there, and it was spreading like a crack in glass. One night, I remember lying in bed, staring into the darkness and whispering to myself, "What if God is real?" It startled me to even think it, let alone say it out loud. Immediately, I shook my head and told myself I was being weak. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to sleep, but my heart wouldn't settle. I couldn't believe I was letting myself even consider the possibility. It felt like betrayal. Betrayal of my own identity, of the pride I had built my life on. That was the beginning of the war inside me. By day, I was still the confident atheist, mocking believers and carrying myself with pride. But by night, I wrestled with a silence that scared me. I didn't tell anyone about it. How could I? I had spent years telling people that faith was for the weak. Admitting that I felt something missing would have made me look like a hypocrite. So I kept it locked inside, pretending it didn't exist. But it did exist, and it was growing stronger. I started noticing small things, like the way believers seemed to have a kind of peace I couldn't explain, or the way some of them faced difficulties without breaking, while I felt fragile even with my achievements. I told myself it was just personality, just luck, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was something more. Maybe they had something real, something I had spent my life rejecting. The cracks were there, but I didn't want to admit it. So I kept telling myself the same phrase, "If God is real, let him prove it." I repeated it like a shield, hoping it would push the doubts away. Instead, the words began to feel heavier, almost dangerous, like I was daring something bigger than myself. Still, I didn't stop. I kept challenging, kept mocking, even as I wondered what would happen if someday, somehow, God actually answered me. I didn't know it at the time, but that empty feeling, those restless nights, and that single haunting question were the first signs of something bigger. The cracks in my pride were beginning to spread, even though I tried to ignore them. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. Something was moving, something I couldn't see, and it was slowly preparing me for the moment when my whole life would shatter, and nothing would ever be the same again. It felt like everything started to collapse at once. The job I had poured myself into for years suddenly slipped through my fingers. One morning, I walked into the office thinking it was just another day, and by afternoon I was walking out with a box of my things. They told me it was downsizing, but it felt personal, like a punch in the gut. My entire identity was wrapped around that career, and now it was gone. I told myself I didn't care. But inside, I was crumbling. Losing my job left me restless, but I thought I still had my relationship to lean on. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few weeks later, my girlfriend sat across from me at dinner, her eyes cold and distant. She said she couldn't keep pretending anymore, that I was too closed off, too emotionless, too empty. She accused me of living without purpose, and those words cut deeper than she knew. By the end of the night, she walked out, leaving me with nothing but silence. I tried to act strong. I told my friends I didn't need her, that I was better off without the stress of a relationship. But when I went home, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor, wondering why everything in my life was falling apart. For years I had mocked the idea of God, claiming I didn't need him. But now I couldn't help thinking, is this some kind of punishment? I hated myself for even thinking that way. Money started drying up faster than I expected. Bills piled up, and without a steady income, I felt the pressure mounting every single day. I picked up temporary jobs here and there, but nothing stable, nothing close to what I had before. I had always prided myself on being in control, on not needing anyone. Now, for the first time, I felt powerless, and the pride I once carried so confidently started to feel more like a curse than a strength. Nights became unbearable. I would lay awake, tossing and turning, replaying every failure in my mind. Sometimes I would mutter under my breath, "If God is real, this must be His way of getting back at me." It was almost laughable. I didn't even believe in Him, yet I was blaming Him. My heart was so conflicted. Part of me was angry, bitter, convinced life was unfair. Another part of me wondered if maybe I had been wrong all along, and this was God trying to wake me up. Friends began to drift away. At first they checked in, offering drinks and distraction, but after a while the invitations stopped coming. No one wants to hang around someone who's sinking. I found myself more and more isolated, sitting in my apartment with nothing but my thoughts. The silence grew heavier each day. For the first time in years, I realized I was truly alone. And that loneliness scared me more than I cared to admit. The worst part was the shame. I'd spent so much of my life mocking believers, calling them weak, calling them fools. Now here I was, crumbling, falling apart, and secretly envying the peace I had once ridiculed. I remembered my girlfriend's words, "You live without purpose," and I couldn't shake them. She was right, I had no purpose. My life was just a string of achievements and sarcasm, and now that everything was stripped away, there was nothing left. I started drinking more than usual, trying to numb the emptiness. At first it worked, at least for a few hours, but when the haze wore off, the pain was worse than before. The bottle didn't silence the questions, it only delayed them. And those questions kept getting louder. What if you were wrong about God? What if this is Him trying to reach you? I tried to push them away, but deep down, I knew I couldn't run forever. There was one night I'll never forget. I was sitting alone in the dark, my head in my hands, and I whispered bitterly, "All right, God. If you're real, then prove it. Do something, show me." The words came out shaky, half anger, half desperation. I never expected anything to happen. I said it just to get the weight off my chest. But after those words left my lips, I felt a chill run down my spine, like I'd just opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Looking back, I can see that this was the beginning of the breaking point. My pride, my confidence, my identity, everything was being stripped away piece by piece. At the time, I thought it was life being cruel, or maybe fate mocking me, but now I realize it was something else. It was God allowing me to be broken, because He knew I would never look for Him until I had nothing left. And little did I know, the real miracle was still on its way. I thought things couldn't get worse, but life had one more blow waiting for me. It was a rainy night, and I was driving home after another long, pointless day. My head was heavy, my chest full of frustration, and I wasn't paying much attention to the road. In a split second, the car in front of me slammed on its brakes. I tried to swerve, but my tires lost grip on the wet asphalt. The next thing I knew, there was a deafening crash, metal twisting, glass shattering, and everything went black for a moment. When I opened my eyes, smoke was rising from the hood of my car. The airbag had deployed, and my body felt like it had been crushed from every angle. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my throat until finally someone pulled the door open and dragged me out. I could hear sirens in the distance and people shouting, but everything sounded muffled, like I was underwater. At the hospital, they told me I was lucky to be alive. Lucky. That word stung because it didn't feel like luck. It felt like another punishment. My ribs were bruised, my back was in excruciating pain, and my movements were limited. Walking became slow, every step sharp and unbearable. I had always been independent, proud of doing everything on my own, but now I couldn't even bend down without wincing. For the first time, I felt truly broken, both inside and out. The doctors said recovery would take time, but patience wasn't something I had. Each day felt like torture. Painkillers dulled the edge, but left me numb and hollow. Nights were worse. I'd lay there, unable to find a comfortable position, staring at the ceiling, asking myself why I was even still alive. Part of me almost wished the accident had finished me. At least then the suffering would have ended. But no, I was stuck in this broken body, trapped in my own pain. Friends stopped calling completely. No one wanted to be around someone bitter and complaining, and I didn't blame them. I had pushed everyone away for so long, and now there was nobody left. My parents lived far, and we hadn't spoken in months. I told myself I didn't need anyone, but the truth was clear. I was alone, broken, and terrified of the future. I couldn't see any way out of the hole I was in. Sometimes late at night, I would replay the accident in my head. The sound of screeching tires, the violent impact, the smell of smoke, it haunted me. And then I'd think about what could have happened. I could have died. In fact, by all logic, I should have died. People don't usually walk away from accidents that violent. And yet here I was, still breathing. That thought kept gnawing at me, whispering a question I didn't want to ask. Why did I survive? I remembered the bitter words I had thrown out into the darkness weeks before. If you're real, then prove it. Now I wondered if this accident was part of that answer, but I didn't want to admit it. My pride fought hard against the idea. Instead, I blamed bad luck, bad timing, and bad choices. Still, in the quiet moments when the pain was too much to bear, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe I had been spared for a reason. The physical pain was relentless. Simple tasks became challenges. Getting out of bed took effort, lifting a bag of groceries felt impossible, and even sitting for long periods left me aching. I hated it. I hated feeling weak. And yet, in that weakness, something strange was happening. My walls, the ones I had built so high against faith, were starting to crack. I had nothing left to lean on, no strength of my own to carry me. One evening after another painful day, I sat in the dark, my body throbbing, my mind racing. I whispered through clenched teeth, "Why, God, if you're there, why are you tearing my life apart piece by piece?" My voice shook, filled with anger but also with something else, desperation. For the first time in years, I wasn't mocking anymore. I was pleading. It scared me to realize how much I needed an answer, how much I wanted to believe someone was listening. Looking back now, I can see that the accident wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck. It was part of the breaking process. My pride, my independence, my arrogance, they were being stripped away. I didn't know it then, but this was God's way of bringing me to my knees. He knew I would never turn to Him until I had nowhere else to go. And this accident, this pain, was the beginning of a shift I could no longer ignore. The days after the accident turned into a blur of pain and silence. At first, a few people checked in, sending texts or calling to see how I was doing. But as weeks passed, the messages slowed down until they stopped completely. I told myself it didn't matter, that I preferred the quiet. But the truth was, every time my phone stayed silent, I felt the sting of abandonment. I'd always prided myself on not needing anyone, yet the emptiness was suffocating. My friends, the ones I used to go out with, had their own lives, parties, jobs, relationships. I watched glimpses of them through social media, living normally, while I was trapped in this prison of pain and uselessness. None of them came by anymore. No one asked if I needed help. It was like I had disappeared, like I no longer existed. For someone who once thought he was strong and independent, realizing I was forgotten was a bitter pill to swallow. Every morning, I woke up to silence. No footsteps in the hallway, no voice calling my name, no plans for the day. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. Loneliness became a constant companion, heavier than the physical pain I carried. At least pain reminded me I was alive. The loneliness, however, made me feel invisible, like I could vanish and nobody would notice for days. That thought haunted me more than anything. The isolation was more than physical. It was emotional. I couldn't bring myself to reach out to anyone. Pride held me back, whispering that asking for help was weakness, but deep down I feared rejection. What if I called and they didn't answer? What if no one cared? So I stayed silent, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. Still, at night, lying awake, I felt the crushing weight of being utterly alone. My family was distant, both geographically and emotionally. I hadn't spoken to them much even before all of this, and now the gap felt insurmountable. I didn't want to hear their pity or their lectures. I didn't want them to see me broken. So I isolated myself further, closing every door that might have offered a glimpse of connection. Looking back, I see I wasn't just abandoned. I was also pushing people away because my pride refused to let them in. There were moments when the silence felt unbearable. I would sit in my apartment staring at the walls and feel like I was losing my mind. The TV played in the background sometimes, just so I wouldn't have to hear the emptiness echo. But it didn't help. The loneliness seeped through everything, a constant reminder that I had built my life on shallow ground. I had chased success, mocked faith, and pushed people aside, and now there was no one left standing beside me. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, I realized something terrifying. I had never truly been alone before. There was always someone to distract me, some noise, some chaos. But now there was nothing. The silence stripped me bare, forcing me to face myself, and I didn't like what I saw. I saw a man full of bitterness, arrogance, and emptiness. It scared me because I didn't know how to fix it, and for the first time, I admitted I couldn't fix it on my own. My thoughts grew darker as the days stretched on. I began to wonder if my life had any purpose at all. If no one cared whether I lived or died, then what was the point? I had lost everything that once gave me meaning, my job, my relationship, my health, my pride. And now, even my sense of belonging was gone. I started to believe the lie that maybe the world would be better off without me. That thought kept creeping closer, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. But there was also something else in the silence, something I couldn't quite explain. In the stillness of my isolation, I began to hear a different kind of whisper, not from people, but from somewhere deeper. It wasn't loud or clear, more like a faint echo in my soul. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as desperation or weakness, but it kept coming back. It felt like someone was trying to reach me, even in my darkness. Looking back now, I can see that the isolation was not an accident. It was another piece of the breaking. God was stripping away every distraction, every illusion of control, every false source of strength. He was leaving me with nothing but the silence, because only there could I finally hear him. At the time, I thought I was abandoned. But in truth, I was being prepared. God was setting the stage for the moment when I would finally cry out to him for real. The anger inside me reached a boiling point. One night, after another day of pain and silence, I finally snapped. I looked up at the ceiling of my dark room as if my words could break through it and reach the heavens. With every ounce of bitterness in me, I shouted, "So this is your answer, God? Destroy me?" My voice echoed in the emptiness, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't mocking God. I was talking to him directly, though it was with rage. It startled me, realizing what I had just done. For years, I denied his existence, laughed at people who prayed, and insisted there was no God. But now here I was, screaming at the very being I claimed didn't exist. It was like something cracked inside me, a wall breaking down. My anger became the first admission that maybe, just maybe, he was real. But if he was, I didn't see him as loving or merciful. I saw him as cruel. I felt like everything had been taken from me piece by piece. My health, my job, my relationships, my dignity. Nothing was left. And so, in my brokenness, I convinced myself that if God was real, then he must be against me. I couldn't wrap my mind around the idea of a God who cared. All I could see was destruction. My bitterness turned every thought into an accusation. Why me? What did I ever do to deserve this? The more I thought about it, the more enraged I became. I replayed my life in my head, the choices I made, the things I had lost, and instead of seeing my own mistakes, I blamed him. I shouted again, louder this time, my voice raw. "Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" My words were filled with venom, but underneath the fury was something else. Desperation. Deep down, I wasn't just angry. I was terrified that maybe I was truly alone without him. I remember pacing the room, my chest heaving with every breath, tears I didn't want falling down my face. It was strange, anger and grief tangled together. I cursed him, and yet I was still speaking to him. I didn't realize it then, but that was the first prayer I had ever truly prayed. It wasn't polite, it wasn't holy, it was raw, ugly and full of rage, but it was real. And I think God heard it louder than any sermon or song. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I kept repeating the same bitter thoughts, my fists clenched as if I could fight the unseen. I felt like I was in a boxing ring with God himself, throwing punches into the air. "If you're real, prove it," I shouted again, the same phrase I had mocked believers with so many times before. But this time, it wasn't a challenge. It was a plea, even if I didn't admit it. The silence after my outburst was unbearable. It was like screaming into a canyon and waiting for an echo that never came. I wanted lightning, thunder, something dramatic to happen, but nothing did, just silence. And that silence cut deeper than any answer could have. If God was real, why wouldn't he answer me? Did he enjoy watching me suffer? The thought filled me with more rage, and yet I couldn't stop talking to him, even if it was through clenched teeth. I realized that my anger was actually proof of something I had never admitted before. I believed he might actually be there. You don't scream at someone you think doesn't exist. My rage was a confession in disguise. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but deep down, I knew I had just crossed a line. I wasn't an atheist anymore. I was something worse. I was a man who hated the very God he couldn't ignore. But even in that moment, something strange happened. As much as I cursed him, I also felt a small flicker of relief. Because if he was real enough to be angry at, then maybe he was real enough to hear me. And if he could hear me, maybe he hadn't abandoned me completely. I didn't understand it, but my fury carried a strange sense of comfort. For the first time, I wasn't yelling into nothing. I was yelling at someone. Looking back, I can see it clearly now. That night of rage was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet see. My anger wasn't pushing God away. It was drawing me closer. Because only someone who truly believed would scream at the sky, expecting to be heard. What I thought was a fight against him was actually my first encounter with him. And he was listening, even to my curses. Especially to my curses. I reached a point where I couldn't carry the weight anymore. Every day felt like a battle I was destined to lose. My body ached from the accident, my mind was drowning in regrets, and my soul felt completely empty. There were mornings I couldn't even find the strength to get out of bed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, asking myself what the point of any of this was. I wasn't living anymore. I was just existing. The thought I never imagined would cross my mind began to settle in. Maybe it would be easier if I just ended it. That terrifying idea came not in a dramatic moment, but quietly, in the silence of a night when the pain was too much. I looked at the bottle of painkillers on my desk and thought, what if I just stopped fighting? The thought scared me, but it also strangely comforted me. At least, it was an escape. I didn't tell anyone about the darkness I was drowning in. Who would even listen? The few people still around had grown tired of my complaints, and I didn't blame them. I isolated myself further, closing the curtains, turning off my phone, shutting out the world. I thought no one would notice if I disappeared. Deep down, I convinced myself that maybe they'd even be relieved. That's how far my mind had sunk. The nights were the worst. The silence became a monster that swallowed me whole. I would lie awake, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, wondering how many more nights I could endure. My mind replayed every mistake, every lost opportunity, every person who had left. It felt like the universe itself was against me. I whispered into the darkness, "I can't do this anymore." Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. The shame was crushing too. I had always been the one who mocked others for being weak, for relying on God, for needing faith to survive. And now here I was, weaker than I had ever been, too broken to keep going. I felt like a hypocrite, like a fool. All my pride was stripped away, and all that was left was a hollow shell of a man. I hated myself for becoming what I had once ridiculed. I thought about the people who would outlive me, my family, my old friends, even my ex. Would they care? Would they even cry? The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that I had become a burden. Maybe leaving was the most merciful thing I could do for everyone. That lie repeated in my head like a broken record. They'd be better off without you. I remember one night, sitting in the dark, tears streaming down my face, holding those pills in my hand. I stared at them for what felt like hours. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't high, I was just broken. I whispered again, "If you're real, God, do something, because I can't do this anymore." It wasn't a challenge this time. It wasn't anger. It was surrender, the most desperate cry of my life. What shocked me was how real that moment felt. It wasn't me trying to win an argument with God anymore. It wasn't me demanding proof like before. It was me begging for help. The anger was gone, the pride was gone. All I had left was the faint hope that maybe someone was listening. And as I sat there clutching the pills, I realized something. Deep down, I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to live like this. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't empty. It felt heavy, almost like someone was there in the room with me, watching. I couldn't explain it. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel completely alone. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't see a light, but there was a presence I couldn't deny. Something was holding me back from going through with it. Looking back now, I believe that was the exact moment God stepped in. I was at the bottom, with nothing left to give, and that's when I first felt His mercy. I didn't know it at the time, but that night was the turning point. I didn't take the pills. I didn't end my life. Somehow, I put them back on the desk and whispered again with trembling lips, "If you're real, please don't leave me." That night, I broke again. I was sitting alone in the dark, the pain in my body throbbing like a reminder that my life had been ripped apart piece by piece. My chest felt heavy, my hands shook, and tears blurred my vision. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my fist against the wall and screamed into the emptiness. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was rage boiling over, a desperate cry that demanded an answer. With my face wet from tears, I shouted the words I had mocked others with so many times. "If God is real, let Him prove it. Right now." My voice cracked halfway through, but I didn't care. It wasn't a polite prayer. It wasn't humble. It was a dare, a challenge, laced with bitterness and pain. I wanted lightning to strike, the ground to shake, something undeniable. I wanted Him to answer in a way that would shut me up forever. For a moment, after the words left my mouth, the room went silent. Not the ordinary silence of an empty room, but something deeper. It was like the air itself had shifted, thick and almost electric. My skin prickled, and I felt this strange tension, as if I had just called out to something that was actually listening. My heart pounded in my chest, and suddenly I wasn't sure if I really wanted an answer. Part of me expected nothing, like always. I thought maybe I'd hear the echo of my own voice and then sink back into despair. But another part of me, some buried, trembling part, was terrified that God might actually respond. For years I had demanded proof, begged for evidence in arrogance, and now in my brokenness I was daring Him again. Only this time, The challenge wasn't born from pride. It came from pain. I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with sobs I couldn't control. My words turned into a ramble between rage and begging. If you're real, then show me. If you care, then stop this. Do something, anything. My voice was hoarse, my throat burned, but I couldn't stop. It felt like my entire soul was spilling out in those desperate cries. I wasn't just asking anymore, I was demanding with everything left in me. At one point, I even laughed through the tears, a bitter laugh that sounded almost insane. You see this? This is your chance. Prove it, God, or maybe you're just as fake as I always said. The words stung me as soon as I said them, because deep down, I realized this wasn't just blasphemy. It was me admitting I wanted him to be real. That was the truth hiding behind my anger. Minutes passed like hours. I thought I'd reached the end of myself, that maybe I'd fall asleep on the floor, drained of every ounce of energy. But something unusual happened. The longer I cried, the more I began to feel that same strange heaviness in the room again. It wasn't threatening, it was steady, almost warm, like the presence I had felt that night with the pills. Only this time it was stronger, undeniable. I froze, my tears still dripping, afraid to move. My mind raced. Was this just my imagination? Was I losing it completely? But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. My challenge had been heard. I didn't get thunder or lightning, but I got something even more terrifying. Silence that wasn't empty. Silence that felt full. I whispered again, my voice softer now. Are you really there? It wasn't angry anymore. It was broken. I didn't expect an audible voice, but I hoped for something, anything. My chest still ached, my life was still a mess, but for the first time I wasn't shouting at the ceiling. I was speaking to someone who, deep down, I feared might actually be listening. And in that moment I realized the irony. My prayer started as blasphemy, a dare thrown into the darkness. But by the time I was done, it had turned into something else entirely, a plea. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of my heart cracking open. My rage against God was slowly becoming a search for him, and that was something I could never have predicted. I sat there on the floor, my face wet, my chest aching, and yet nothing happened. No thunder shook the walls, no lightning cut through the night sky. The ceiling didn't open up, and no booming voice came to answer me. By every measure, it looked like my prayer or challenge had gone unheard, just like all the other times I had dared God to show up. And yet, I couldn't shake this strange weight in the air. It wasn't heavy in a crushing way, not like guilt or fear. It was different, subtle, almost impossible to describe. The silence wasn't empty, it was thick, like the whole room was filled with something I couldn't see. I sat still, confused, almost afraid to move. For the first time in my life, silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like company. My thoughts raced. I kept trying to rationalize it away. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But no excuse seemed enough to explain what I felt in that moment. It was as if someone invisible had just walked into the room. And though I couldn't see them, I could feel them standing close. My skin tingled and my heart beat faster with a mix of fear and curiosity. I whispered into the air, "Is that you?" The words shocked me the second they left my lips. I had mocked people all my life for talking to a God they couldn't see, and here I was, doing the very same thing. But somehow, it didn't feel stupid. It felt natural, like I wasn't just talking to the ceiling anymore. I was talking to someone who was actually there, listening in silence. The longer I sat in that quiet, the more something shifted inside me. The anger that had burned so fiercely just minutes earlier began to lose its edge. My breathing slowed, and though I was still in pain, I felt strangely calmer. It didn't make sense. I had no answers, no miracles, no booming confirmation from the heavens. But I felt a presence that I couldn't deny. For years, I had demanded proof in loud debates, in smug arguments, in sarcastic remarks. And now, proof was here, but it didn't look like what I had asked for. Instead of fire from the sky, I got silence. Instead of visible evidence, I got a feeling deep in my chest, a whisper that said I wasn't as alone as I thought. It was both frustrating and comforting at the same time. I remember sitting there, staring at the shadows on my wall, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then another thought came to me, one that shook me even more. What if this silence was the answer? What if God had been there all along, and I'd just been too loud, too arrogant, too angry to notice him in the quiet? That thought scared me, because it meant I couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. I didn't suddenly jump up and say, "I believe." No, it wasn't like that, but I also couldn't walk away unchanged. Something had happened in that silence, something I couldn't explain away with science or logic. My heart felt cracked open, exposed, vulnerable in a way it had never been before. It was like a seed had been planted, and though I didn't know it then, it was already starting to grow. I stayed there for a long time, listening to that loaded silence, waiting for something more. Part of me still wanted a sign, a miracle, something undeniable. But another part of me, small but growing, realized that maybe the silence was the miracle. That maybe God was speaking not with thunder, but with presence, and that was enough to keep me from giving up completely. When I finally lay down that night, exhausted and drained, I felt different, not fixed, not healed, not suddenly faithful, but different. For the first time in my life, I couldn't call myself a total atheist anymore. Something had shifted, something I couldn't ignore. And deep inside, a question kept echoing. What if he's really there? That question followed me into sleep, and it never let go. I can't explain what happened next. One moment I was sitting in that silence, still half angry, half broken, and the next, something shifted inside me. It started as a warmth in my chest, faint at first, almost like the glow of a small fire. But then it spread, filling me from the inside out. It wasn't physical heat, not like a fever. It was different, deeper, like something alive was touching my very soul. At first I panicked. I thought maybe I was losing control of my body, that my exhaustion and stress had finally pushed me into some kind of breakdown. But the fear didn't last long. The warmth kept growing, and with it came this incredible sense of peace. It was as if every worry, every pain, every heavy thought I'd been carrying for years was being lifted off my shoulders, one by one. I sat there stunned, hardly daring to breathe. My whole life I had laughed at stories of spiritual experiences. I called them brain tricks, emotional highs, delusions for the weak. But what I felt in that moment was more real than anything else I had ever known. It wasn't my imagination. It was something greater than me, something I couldn't control or explain away. Tears started to fall again, but this time they weren't angry tears. They weren't from pain or despair. They were different, gentle, cleansing, almost joyful. For the first time in years, I cried not out of hopelessness, but out of release. It was like my soul had been locked in a cage all my life, and now the door was finally open. I didn't know what to do with the freedom, but I knew it was real. The pain in my body didn't vanish, and the problems in my life didn't magically disappear. But somehow, none of it felt crushing anymore. It was as if a hand had reached inside me and pulled out the weight I had been dragging for so long. I could breathe again, really breathe, without the heaviness pressing on my chest. That alone felt like a miracle. I remember whispering, "What is this?" Even though deep down I already knew the answer. It wasn't science, it wasn't logic, it wasn't something I could measure or explain. It was God, the very God I had mocked, insulted, and challenged my whole life. The very one I had dared to say wasn't real. And now he was here, filling me with a peace I had never known. I felt small in that moment, smaller than I had ever felt before. But strangely, it didn't feel humiliating. It felt right. For years, my pride had been my shield. I thought I had all the answers, thought I was above faith, above weakness. And yet here I was, completely undone by something I couldn't deny. I realized that maybe being small wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of truth. Time seemed to stop. I don't know if it lasted minutes or hours. I just know that I didn't want it to end. That warmth, that peace, that presence. It was like finding the very thing I had been chasing all my life without even knowing it. Every success, every argument, every rejection of faith, it had all been me searching for something only God could give. I didn't pray fancy words. I didn't suddenly know the Bible or recite prayers. All I could say through trembling lips was, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Those words felt strange in my mouth, but they were true. For the first time, I wasn't mocking God. I was acknowledging Him, humbling myself in a way I had never thought I could. When the experience began to fade, the peace didn't leave. It stayed, like an anchor in my soul. I knew my problems weren't over, but I also knew I wasn't alone anymore. Something supernatural had happened in that room, something that no argument, no doubt, no pride could ever erase. And that night, I went to sleep with a certainty I never thought I would feel. God is real. I don't know how to describe it except to say it wasn't like hearing a normal voice. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't sound hitting my ears. It was inside me, deeper than my own thoughts, clear and undeniable. The words were simple. You are not alone. Just 4 words, but they hit me harder than anything I'd ever experienced in my life. The moment those words settled into my heart, I broke. All the walls I had built over the years, the sarcasm, the pride, the logic, the constant need to be in control, collapsed in an instant. I fell to my knees right there on the floor. Tears poured down my face, and for once, I didn't try to stop them. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't angry. I was just undone. I'd told myself for so long that I didn't need anyone, that people were weak for leaning on God, that I was smarter and stronger because I stood on my own. But in that moment, I realized I had never truly stood alone. I had only been empty, trying to convince myself it was strength. And now, hearing those words, I felt the kind of love and companionship I never even believed existed. There was no judgment in that voice, no anger, no condemnation for all the years I mocked Him. It wasn't the voice of someone who wanted revenge. It was gentle, kind, almost fatherly. It didn't shame me. It didn't list my mistakes. It simply reminded me of the truth I had been running from. I had never been alone, not even in my darkest moments. I thought about all the times I had dared God to prove Himself, all the challenges I had shouted into the void. And here He was, not answering with thunder or punishment, but with a whisper that was stronger than any argument I'd ever made, more powerful than any logic I had leaned on. That whisper was enough to crush years of disbelief in a single second. On my knees, I couldn't stop saying, "I'm sorry." Over and over again, those were the only words that would come out. Sorry for my arrogance, sorry for my anger, sorry for pretending I didn't need Him. Each word felt like another weight falling off me. The more I said it, the lighter I felt, as if forgiveness was wrapping around me like a blanket. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting anymore. I wasn't trying to win an argument, wasn't trying to defend myself, wasn't trying to prove that I was smarter than faith. I was just surrendered. I didn't even know what that meant fully, but I knew that's what was happening. My heart, stubborn for so long, had finally let go. I realized then that God hadn't abandoned me in my pain. I had abandoned Him. Every time I cursed Him, every time I mocked, every time I claimed He wasn't real, He was still there, waiting for the moment I would finally stop running, stop pretending, and just listen. And when I finally did, He didn't yell. He didn't punish. He just said, "You are not alone." That night, on the floor of my room, I experienced something I never thought I would: the death of my pride. And strangely enough, it didn't feel like death at all. It felt like life. Like something new was being born inside me, something real, something unshakable. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of being weak, because I finally understood I wasn't weak. I was loved. When I finally lifted my head, my face was soaked with tears, but I didn't care. For once, I didn't care how I looked or what anyone would think. I knew this wasn't some emotional breakdown. This was real. This was God meeting me at my lowest point, speaking directly into my soul. And I knew that night, everything in my life was about to change. As I sat there on the floor, still shaking from what had just happened, my own words came back to haunt me. That phrase I had thrown at heaven for years: "If God is real, let him prove it." I had shouted it in anger. I had mocked people with it. I had worn it like a badge of pride. And now, here I was, realizing that he had just answered me in a way I could never deny. For so long, I expected some grand event, something undeniable to the outside world. A flash of lightning, an earthquake, some scientific impossibility that would leave no room for doubt. But instead, the proof had come quietly, in a whisper inside my heart. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was exactly what I needed. And deep down, I knew it was more real than any physical sign could ever be. It hit me then that I had been setting the terms of the challenge all along. I was demanding God prove himself my way, on my conditions. But the God I just encountered wasn't small enough to fit into my arrogant rules. He had chosen his way, gentle, personal, undeniable to me, even if invisible to others. And that made it even more powerful, because I couldn't fake or explain it away. I thought back on all those moments when I told believers they were delusional, when I rolled my eyes at prayers and mocked testimonies. And here I was, with my own testimony unfolding right inside me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become the very thing I swore I would never be, a man who had experienced God for himself. The memory of all my challenges made me feel a strange mix of shame and gratitude. Shame because of how arrogant I had been, how blind and stubborn. Gratitude because, despite my pride, God still chose to answer me. He didn't owe me anything. He could have ignored me, left me to my pain and anger. But he didn't. He proved himself in mercy, not in wrath. I realized then that this was no coincidence. The timing, the sequence of events, the brokenness that led me to this exact night, it was all part of the answer. Every loss, every wound, every lonely hour had pushed me to the place where I could finally hear him. The proof I had demanded didn't come in the way I expected, but it had been building all along, piece by piece. I sat there whispering the words to myself: "If God is real, let him prove it." And then, quietly, I whispered back my own answer: "You did." For the first time, I admitted it, not with sarcasm, not with defiance, but with a broken kind of humility. The challenge I had thrown at him had become the doorway through which he walked into my life. The strangest thing was how certain I felt. All my life I had prided myself on logic and evidence, and here I was, more sure of this invisible presence than anything I could touch with my hands. It wasn't blind faith. It was an encounter, something undeniable, something no argument could ever erase. This was the proof I had asked for, even if it didn't fit my definition, and as I thought about it, I realized maybe that was the point. If the proof had come my way, it would have fed my pride, given me another excuse to argue and twist things. But because it came his way, I couldn't control it. I couldn't explain it away. I could only receive it. The proof wasn't just for my mind, it was for my heart, and my heart finally believed. That night, I knew something had shifted forever. The words I had once used as a weapon against believers had now become the words that marked the beginning of my own faith. I had asked God to prove himself, and he had. Not with thunder, not with lightning, but with a whisper that broke through the hardest walls of my soul. Something inside me shifted after that night. For years, my heart had been fueled by anger. Anger at life, at people, and especially at the very idea of God. But slowly, almost without me realizing it, the sharp edges of that rage began to soften. It was as if the heavy storm inside my chest had started to calm, leaving behind a quiet stillness I had never felt before. The emptiness that used to echo in me every night no longer felt so dark. I didn't understand it fully, but I knew something had filled that hollow space I carried for years. I couldn't name it yet, but it was real. It wasn't just positive thinking or some mental trick. It was something greater, something beyond me. And that something felt alive. My physical pain was still there. The aches in my body didn't disappear overnight, and I still had trouble moving without discomfort. But even with the pain, my heart felt lighter. It was strange, like I could endure it more easily now. The suffering didn't own me anymore. Hope had stepped into the room where despair used to live, and it made all the difference. I noticed I wasn't snapping at people the way I used to. Even the smallest things, which once triggered my frustration, now seemed smaller. When someone ignored me or looked at me the wrong way, I didn't feel the same fire of resentment burning. Instead, there was this quiet voice in the back of my mind saying, "Let it go." And for the first time I could. It was shocking to realize how much of my life had been built around bitterness. I had worn it like armor, thinking it made me strong, when in reality, it was crushing me. Now, little by little, that armor was cracking, falling off. I didn't feel weaker without it. In fact, I felt stronger, freer, like I could breathe deeper than ever before. The strangest part was the hope. I hadn't felt hope in years. To me, life had always been a cold game where you either won or lost, and I had been losing. But now a small flame burned inside me. It told me tomorrow could be different, that my story wasn't over yet. That simple thought gave me a strength I never expected to find. I started waking up with a different mindset. Instead of dreading the day, I found myself curious about it. What if today something good happened? What if there was a reason to keep going? That shift was so new and so foreign that I almost didn't trust it at first. But day after day, it kept showing up, and I couldn't deny it was real. Even in moments when doubt tried to creep back in, that peace I had felt on the floor during my breakdown reminded me of the truth. It wasn't just a one-time event. It was a spark that kept burning, and every time I remembered that voice saying, "You are not alone," my heart steadied again. I realized that I wasn't fighting my battles alone anymore. I caught myself smiling one morning. It had been so long since I had smiled for no reason that it felt almost unnatural. But it was real. I felt lighter, freer, less chained to the darkness I once called home. My circumstances hadn't magically improved, but inside I was changing. That, I began to understand, was the greatest miracle of all. Looking back, I could see how God hadn't removed every pain or fixed every problem overnight. Instead, He started by changing me from the inside. My heart was different, my perspective was shifting, and my soul was breathing for the first time. The battle wasn't over, but I no longer feared it, because hope had taken root, and once hope grows, it doesn't let go. The very next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up a Bible. It had been sitting on a shelf, covered in dust, almost like a relic from another lifetime. I don't even know what pushed me to grab it, but something inside told me to open it. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, wondering if I would feel anything at all. For so long I had mocked this book, dismissed it as fiction, and yet here I was, desperate to see if it could speak to me. I landed on a passage without planning it. My eyes stopped on words that cut deeper than I expected. It felt as if the page had been waiting for me all this time, like it had been quietly sitting there with a message only for me. I read slowly, each line sinking into my mind, making me pause and breathe heavier. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional, almost like someone had guided my hand. What shocked me most was how the words seemed to mirror exactly what I was going through. The verses spoke of pain, of loss, but also of hope. and renewal. It was as if God himself was answering the question I had shouted into the night just hours earlier. I sat there in silence, the Bible open on my lap, my heart pounding as though I had just heard a personal reply. For the first time, I didn't see the Bible as just an old book. I saw it as a living voice. I couldn't explain it in logical terms, but I knew it was more than coincidence. These words were alive, and they were speaking directly into my situation. I felt seen. I felt known. And that realization made tears stream down my face before I could stop them. It was overwhelming to think that God might have heard me after all those years of mocking him. I remembered how many times I had scoffed at believers, how often I had said faith was just blind foolishness. Now here I was, with undeniable proof that something greater was reaching into my brokenness. I had asked for a sign, and maybe this was it. Not lightning or thunder, but words on a page, living and breathing. I whispered the lines out loud, almost afraid my voice would break the moment. Yet, the more I read, the calmer I felt. It wasn't just about the meaning of the text, it was the presence behind the words. I could sense it filling the room, filling my chest, wrapping around me like a comfort I had never known. For the first time, I wasn't reading about God. I was meeting him through these words. When I closed the Bible, I sat in silence for a long time. I didn't know what to call this feeling. Peace, hope, maybe both, but I knew it wasn't from me. Left on my own, I only ever found emptiness. This was different. This was coming from somewhere outside myself, and it was more real than anything I had ever experienced. I thought about all the nights I had laughed at believers for reading this same book, calling them delusional. Now I realized they weren't chasing fairy tales. They were holding on to something alive, something I had been blind to for so long. The thought humbled me so deeply that I had to bow my head, not in shame, but in gratitude. It was a small step, just one morning of opening a book I had rejected for so long. But that step felt like a doorway. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Something had started inside me, something that would not let me go back to the way I was before. That day, I understood what faith really meant. It wasn't about having all the answers or pretending everything made sense. It was about trusting the one who was speaking to me through that ancient book. I didn't know everything, but I knew this. I wasn't alone, and I never would be again. That realization was the first true step of faith I had ever taken. That same week, something happened that I could never have predicted. Out of nowhere, I received a phone call from the company where I had once worked. It had been months since they let me go, and I had convinced myself that door was closed forever. I almost didn't answer the call, thinking it was a mistake. But when I picked up, I heard a familiar voice on the other end offering me something I never expected, a new opportunity. At first, I didn't know what to say. My pride wanted to act casual, as if I had been fine without them all along. But inside I was trembling. I had just started to believe that God was real, that he was with me, and now here was something tangible, almost like a response from heaven. It wasn't the kind of miracle I used to demand, but it felt even more personal. I asked the caller to repeat themselves just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. They explained that a new position had opened up, one better suited to my skills, and they wanted me to return. I couldn't believe it. After losing everything, after hitting rock bottom, after screaming to the sky in anger, suddenly, the very place that had cast me out was now inviting me back in. It was overwhelming. Hanging up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time. My mind went back to the moment when I had said, "If God is real, let him prove it." It struck me that maybe, little by little, he was proving it. Not with fireworks or supernatural displays, but with gentle, undeniable steps. First, the peace in my heart, then the words of Scripture, and now a door opening in my life that I could not have forced on my own. I remember falling to my knees again, but this time it wasn't from desperation, it was gratitude. I thanked God, even though I still wasn't sure how to pray properly. The words stumbled out of my mouth, but I meant every one of them. I told him I didn't deserve this chance, that I had mocked him for so long, yet here he was, showing me grace I could never earn. When I told a close friend about the call, he looked at me with wide eyes. "That's incredible," he said. "You've been talking about all these strange things happening lately, and now this sounds like someone's trying to get your attention." Hearing those words from someone else made me realize this wasn't just in my imagination. Even others could see it. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was no coincidence. Too many things had lined up in ways I could not explain. I'd been stripped of everything, broken down until I had nothing left. And just when I admitted I needed help, just when I dared to open my heart, pieces of my life started falling back into place. It was like God was restoring me from the ground up. I remembered how bitter and angry I had been when I first lost that job. I had cursed God for letting it happen, but now, looking back, I could see that maybe it had been necessary. If I had stayed in my comfort, I never would have questioned my pride, never would have reached the point of surrender. Losing everything had been the very thing that prepared me to finally see Him. When I accepted the new position, I did it with a completely different mindset. Before, work was just about money, status, and proving myself. Now, I saw it as a gift, something undeserved, something entrusted to me. I walked into that office not as the same man who had left in anger, but as someone being slowly transformed from the inside out. That job offer was more than just employment, it was confirmation. It was God showing me that He was not only real, but active in my life. It was His way of whispering, "I am restoring you." And for the first time, I started to believe not just in God's existence, but in His goodness, His timing, and His desire to give me a new beginning. I didn't realize how much damage my pride had caused until I started thinking about the people I had hurt. For years, I had dismissed their beliefs, mocked their faith, and acted as if I was smarter than everyone else. Now, with this new sense of humility growing in me, I couldn't ignore the weight of my past actions anymore. It wasn't just about my relationship with God. It was about reconciling with the people I had wounded along the way. The first step was terrifying. I reached out to an old friend I had laughed at in high school for being a Christian. I had ridiculed him publicly, made jokes at his expense, and thought it made me clever. When I called him, I half expected him to hang up or refuse to listen. Instead, he answered with surprise, and when I apologized, he stayed quiet for a moment before saying, "I never thought I'd hear those words from you." That silence said more than anything else. Each apology was like peeling back a layer of my pride. I reached out to family members I had argued with, co-workers I had belittled, and even people I barely remembered offending. Sometimes they forgave me quickly, almost as if they had been waiting for this moment. Other times, they were cautious, unsure if my change was real. I couldn't blame them. After all, I had spent years building a reputation of arrogance. But even when forgiveness wasn't immediate, I still felt a strange peace. It wasn't about getting everyone's approval anymore. It was about doing what was right. I finally understood that humility isn't weakness, it's strength. It takes more courage to admit you were wrong than to keep pretending you were right. Every apology was a step toward freedom, like chains breaking one by one. Some reactions surprised me. A few people were deeply moved, saying they could see a light in me that wasn't there before. Others were skeptical, waiting to see if this new version of me would last. In the past, I would have been desperate to prove myself right. But now, I realized it wasn't about proving anything. Time and actions would speak louder than words, and I just needed to walk differently. One of the hardest apologies was to my ex-girlfriend. She had told me I was cold, empty, and arrogant. Back then, I thought she was the problem. Now, I could see how right she had been. I reached out not to fix the relationship, but simply to admit I had been wrong. She didn't know what to say at first. But eventually she said, "I hope this change is real for you." Her words cut deep, but they also gave me hope. Each act of reconciliation felt like another layer of my old self being stripped away. I no longer wanted to be the man who had to win every argument, who had to feel superior. I wanted to be someone who lifted others up instead of tearing them down. And strangely enough, asking for forgiveness didn't make me feel small. It made me feel alive. There were moments when I wanted to stop, when it felt too uncomfortable to keep admitting my failures. But I kept remembering that quiet voice I had heard, "You are not alone." It reminded me that God wasn't asking me to do this alone. He was with me in every phone call, every awkward conversation, every painful memory. That gave me strength to keep going. As I went through this process, I realized reconciliation was more than just healing relationships. It was healing me. Each time someone forgave me, I felt lighter, freer, as if God was restoring not just my reputation, but my very soul. I was no longer chained to my past mistakes. Looking back, I can see that this was the first time I truly experienced humility. Not the fake kind I sometimes put on to manipulate people, but the real kind that strips you down and rebuilds you from the inside. And in that humility, I found something I never thought possible: peace with God, peace with others, and peace within myself. Life didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale after that. I didn't wake up one day with all my problems gone, my pain healed, and every broken piece fixed. But something had shifted so deeply inside me that even the struggles felt different. I began to realize that what had happened wasn't destruction. It was reconstruction. God hadn't set out to ruin me. He had set out to break the pride that was killing me from within. The physical pain from my accident still lingered, but it no longer controlled me the way it once had. Before, I saw it as a cruel punishment, proof that life was unfair. Now, I began to see it as a reminder that weakness isn't the end of the story. Through weakness, I was learning dependence, learning to lean on God instead of myself. That in itself was a kind of healing I had never known I needed. Work was different too. When I got the new opportunity, I approached it with a completely different heart. Before, I measured my worth by promotions, salaries, and recognition. Now I saw work as a gift, not a trophy. I treated people with respect, even the ones I once would have mocked or dismissed. Slowly, I realized that true success wasn't about climbing higher, but about standing firm on a foundation that couldn't be shaken. Relationships began to shift as well. Some people kept their distance, maybe unsure if my change was real, but others drew closer, curious about the transformation they saw in me. I didn't feel the need to argue anyone into believing what I believed anymore. Instead, I just tried to live differently, to let my actions speak where my words used to shout. It was humbling, but it was also freeing. There were still nights when doubt whispered in my mind, when I wondered if I was imagining everything, if this change was just an emotional phase. But every time I quieted myself, that same gentle presence reminded me, "You are not alone." That assurance became the anchor I held onto when everything else felt uncertain. I started to read more of the Bible, not just as words on a page, but as a voice speaking directly to me. Passages I once thought were outdated or irrelevant now felt alive, cutting through me with truth I couldn't deny. I realized it wasn't just a book, it was a mirror showing me who I was and who I could become. That realization became the fuel for my growth. As I continued to rebuild, I learned that God wasn't offering me perfection, He was offering me purpose. And purpose felt far richer than the shallow victories I used to chase. Even on bad days, I could rest, knowing that I wasn't just drifting through life anymore. My pain, my past, even my failures were part of something greater than myself. The more I reflected, the more I saw how my old life had been built on sand. Pride, achievements, mocking others, all of it had no real foundation. No wonder it collapsed so easily when the storms came. But now, piece by piece, my life was being rebuilt on something solid. Not my strength, not my wisdom, but God's grace. That foundation couldn't be shaken, no matter what came. There were moments when I still missed who I used to be, the confidence, the control, the false sense of superiority. But every time those thoughts came, I remembered where that life had led me. Empty, broken, alone. And then I remembered where this new path was leading me, toward peace, reconciliation, and a hope that didn't depend on circumstances. In the end, I realized God hadn't destroyed me. He had saved me from myself. He had broken the shell of arrogance and disbelief that I had built around my heart, not to leave me in ruins, but to rebuild me from the inside out. And though my life was far from perfect, for the first time ever, it was real, it was solid, and it was worth living. I used to think my story was one of strength, of logic, of building a life without any need for God. I thought faith was weakness, and that I was better than those who believed. But in reality, I was blind. My pride built a prison around me, and I didn't even notice the chains tightening until everything started to collapse. When the walls came crashing down, I thought it was the end, but it turned out to be the beginning. Looking back now, I see how each piece of my life was being redirected. Losing my job, my relationships, my health, it all felt like cruelty at the time, but it was actually grace, though I couldn't recognize it then. Grace stripped away the illusions I clung to so tightly, leaving me exposed, broken, and ready to listen for the first time. That's when I finally heard the whisper I'd spent years mocking. You are not alone. That moment became the turning point of everything. It wasn't about a thunderbolt from the sky or some dramatic miracle that could be proven under a microscope. It was about a presence, a peace, and a love I had never known before. The proof I had demanded all my life didn't come the way I expected, but it came in the way I needed most. It came as an answer to the cry I never admitted was buried deep inside me. Today, I can say with honesty that my life is not perfect. I still struggle with doubts, with pain, and with the consequences of the choices I made before. But I also carry something I never had before. Hope, real hope. Not the fragile kind built on success or pride, but the kind anchored in someone greater than myself. That hope is what carries me forward. When I share my story now, I don't do it to win arguments or to prove people wrong. I do it because I know there are others like me. People who think they don't need God, who think they're too smart for faith, who think life is under control until it all falls apart. I share my testimony because I want them to know that when everything else fails, God doesn't. It humbles me to admit that the same God I mocked for so many years never turned his back on me. He waited, patiently, silently, and when I finally broke, he was there, not to condemn me, but to lift me up. That truth is still overwhelming to me. It's not something I earned or deserved. It was mercy, pure and undeserved. If you had told me years ago that I would one day believe, I would have laughed in your face. If you had told me I'd be sharing a testimony, I would have ridiculed you. Yet here I am, living proof that God can change even the hardest of hearts. My life is evidence that no one is too far gone, too broken, or too proud for him to reach. I once cursed God and demanded proof. I once shouted into the void, convinced no one was listening. But he heard me, he answered, not by destroying me, but by saving me. That night, when I fell to my knees with nothing left, my life changed forever, and I have never been the same since. This is my testimony, not of strength but of weakness, not of victory I achieved but of mercy I received. I tell it because it's real, because it's the truth that set me free, and because someone, somewhere, needs to know that the same God who met me in my darkness can meet them in theirs too. I am not who I used to be. I am living proof of grace, and I will never stop sharing it because this is more than just my story. It's his story written in my life, ex-atheist testimony, and that's my story. I don't share it because I'm proud of who I used to be. I share it because I'm amazed at what God did when I least deserved it. I went from mocking his name to calling on him in desperation, and he answered with love instead of judgment. If you're watching this and you feel lost, broken, or like you've tried everything and nothing works, I want you to know the same thing I discovered. You are not alone. The God I once denied is the same God who never gave up on me, and he hasn't given up on you either. So don't wait for everything to fall apart before you turn to him. He's already closer than you think, ready to meet you right where you are. That night changed my life forever, and it can change yours too. Thank you for listening to my story.